the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators 2024 National Forum was hosted by our Victorian branch. Exploring the R's of ecological restoration, restoring biodiversity through resilience, regeneration, reintroduction, and reconnecting to country.
Liam Gallagher is our next presenter, who is going to talk about igniting change, collaboration for cultural fire. Liam has a Master's in Disaster and Emergency Management with Charles Darwin University and has been with the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action for 3 years, working previously as a Forest and Fire Operations Officer. Liam's role as a cultural burn officer is to support the cultural fire and land management goals of traditional owners across the Port Phillip region, which includes all of metropolitan Melbourne. Liam is passionate about traditional owner cultural fire rights and the environmental benefits of cultural fire in the Victorian landscape. Please welcome Liam.
All right. Fire is a powerful and enduring force that has had a profound influence on the Australian landscape. The method of managing country using fire has been employed for over a millennium by Aboriginal people. In regions across Australia, there is a proliferation of Indigenous communities applying, adapting and rejuvenating Indigenous fire practices and burning regimes through a range of land management activities and partnerships. The proliferation of cultural fire practices across Australia has led to a collision between traditional fire management and the risk-adverse fire management strategies of government agencies. Today, we will explore the significance of cultural fire and its role as a land management tool, the barriers to collaboration, and identifying ways in which organisations and government agencies can develop collaborative pathways to better support traditional owners and their fire goals. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the traditional owner groups and organisations that I have the privilege of working with on a daily basis, and I know some of them are here today. I would like to pay my deepest respects to their connection to the land and waters and their unique ability to care for country through the spiritual act of applying fire. I'd like to honour the ancestors that have walked the path before me, and I know we walk on the shoulders of giants. For those of you that didn't like history in high school, we're going to go through a quick history lesson. It's going to be quite short, so don't worry about it too much. So Aboriginal people have been using fire as a tool for managing country for many, many years. Although there is some conflicting evidence around exactly when the use of fire proliferated across Australia, there's a growing range of scholars who have identified how fire has changed the Australian landscape, from historians to fire ecologists and botanists who have demonstrated that the Australian landscape has been shaped by Aboriginal fire practices. Now, the first colonists have described the intricate linkages between Aboriginal use of fire and the intrinsic management of the Australian continent. In January 1802, off Cape Schanck and in the Port Phillip Bay area, it was found impossible to survey any part of the coast as yet from the numerous native fires which covered the low shore in one continuous volume of smoke. Furthermore, early European settlers often described the continent as wild in an unfamiliar environment, but what they actually encountered was a landscape that had been very consciously and deliberately shaped by fire in what could be described as a continent-wide economic and social strategy to support human life and protect faunal and floral species. This strategy was described in 1826 by Dumont d'Urville in Western Port Bay, who stated, and we are talking about the 1800s here, so some of the language is exactly word for word, enveloped in huge spiralling clouds of smoke, no doubt resulting from the habitual burning off by the savages, fine stands of trees, easy to get through, vast grass-covered clearings, with well-defined paths linked by other tracks, so regular and well marked. It is hard to conceive how these could have happened without the hand of man. Fast forward to the present, and in the wake of the 1920 Black Summer bushfires, the hot and dry conditions combined with the existence of large areas that have not been managed through local fire and land management practices led to 126,000 kilometres square, or 12.6 million hectares of Australia being burnt between August 2019 and March 2020. The impacts of this have galvanised the Australian community in terms of learning from Aboriginal communities in terms of fire. So what is cultural fire? Well, Indigenous fire practices are holistic in nature. They incorporate an intricate number of dimensions that are intertwined with the spiritual and physical nature of the world. This encompasses customary law, economies, social relations and structures, ecology, and diverse technologies such as season indicators. These are inclusive of culturally embedded mediating and explanatory factors, such as signals that are received from country when it is the right time for burning, such as the flowering of particular species of trees, the kinship relationships to determine who can actually light and apply the fire to country, and the knowledge of cultural sites and cultural resources that influence the pathways of fire at a very fine scale across the landscape. The importance of fire is coupled with the innate knowledge and understanding of the interplays of local environments. As one elder describes, fire creates new life. That's how they started off. They burn, then new grasses grow, then the animals come on. It was part of the daily routine. You burn grass, you get new shoots coming up, you get wallabies and kangaroos coming on, and emus and that feeding, and that's how they survived. That was the main reason for fire. So cultural fire is more than a complex knowledge system connected to one's environment and maximising it for one's survival. It is connected to law. It is connected to spiritual and kinship relationships. So put simply, cultural fire has many tangible and intangible benefits to the environment and to people. These include caring for country, regenerating and protecting native species, fuel reduction to protect important places, and I'm not talking about fuel reduction like how my own organisation delivers fuel reduction, meaningful employment now in the 21st century, and improved decision-making power on traditional estates. So, when I was told that I was going to present today, I thought, I'm not an ecologist or an environmental practitioner, but I know the people in the room are. So I decided I'd go look for a case study. Okay? So there's a growing body of research into the impacts and benefits of cultural fire. These will not be exhausted here today. Like I said, I'm not an ecologist, but I refer to a case study conducted by Greenwood and Co. That was delivered on Martu country. And I'm just going to read some lines that highlight the findings that they had through the application of fire by the traditional owners there. And they said that there's strong evidence that pyrodiversity increases the richness and the diversity of plants and some plant groups in the western deserts. The maximum extent of large wildfires appeared to reduce plant richness, while the extent of mid-successional vegetation tended to enhance the diversity of several plant groups, including the edible species, and increase their richness in the overall footprint. The study demonstrated that Martu burning increases the diversity of visible and invisible fire mosaics, and that such pyrodiversity is negatively associated with fire size. The findings underscore the importance of Indigenous fire regimes for promoting plant diversity in fire-prone ecosystems. Now, although this is but one example of the benefits of cultural fire from a purely ecological objective, as an Aboriginal person myself, the innate connection to country and spirit that arises when delivering fire is something that cannot necessarily be tangibly described. So, I guess in short, re-establishing fire regimes and holistic traditional management practices can create many opportunities for Indigenous empowerment, contributing to significant cultural, environmental, social and economic benefits. Many land and emergency management agencies have only recently begun to acknowledge that they have obligations to work towards partnerships with First Nations peoples. This has led to some successful partnerships and policy interventions here in Victoria, the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy. But there are many gaps and significant improvements required to meet Indigenous expectations around fire management. I'm going to touch on some of these briefly, and some of you may have heard or not have heard of these. Current barriers are often embedded due to different perspectives in understanding fire. It has been argued that since colonisation, the settler experience with fire is rooted in a combative mindset that employs paramilitary concepts to guide its relationship with fire. This has direct linkages in terms of the perceptions of fire that differ between fire agencies and Indigenous peoples. The public and government are often threatened by fire, which does create enormous political pressure on traditional owner-led burns in the 21st century. Furthermore, this idea of holistic landscape approach that is intrinsic to Indigenous cultural burning is often in stark contrast to agency thinking, whereby the focus of agencies is to break down complex systems into silos to treat them separately. This goes against its wholeness and the special relationship between people, country, fire, and the spiritual world. Legislation and regulation. Well, this one's pretty simple, and I'll actually step away from my notes. Put simply, I mean, cultural fire is a thing that's been delivered prior to colonisation for thousands and thousands of years. And as part of that colonisation process, you look at any form of legislation these days and there's no mention of cultural burning or traditional owner rights in terms of fire. It's completely omitted. There is some work being done in the space at the moment around updating and refreshing regulations and legislation and that where it's possible. But these things are at the will of government and do take time. Land tenure is a very particular issue. Again, another Western construct that is in stark contrast to Indigenous ways of thinking around land use. It carves and puts arbitrary lines on a map that restrict cultural practice and activities. Cultural fire is deeply influenced by the presence of ancestral beings in the landscape, which provide a source of lore about fire and are connected to story places, tracks, song lines, and cultural sites. Again, these are often constrained by land tenureship status, which may restrict the use of fire. For example, burning on public land must adhere to different rules and procedures compared to that of private land. I'll whip through these last ones pretty quick. Funding and resources. Everyone in this room knows that you need money and you need people to do the good work that we all want to do. This is no different for First Nations groups as well in terms of their goals and aspirations around managing and healing country. Accreditation and training. Well, again, legislation requires people to be accredited and trained to the things they're doing to make sure it's safe, to make sure they're wearing the appropriate PPC. These things, require highly inappropriate levels of qualifications to attend a low-intensity burn in the middle of winter. We require full PPE as though the burn was going to be delivered in the stark heat of summer and is going to roar through the entire 0.5 of a hectare block. Again, liabilities and insurance. You need to be insured. If you're not insured, it's almost impossible to do anything. It's quite difficult for smaller traditional owner corporations that aren't registered Aboriginal parties under legislation to get high levels of liability insurance compared to registered Aboriginal parties who do. Again, another preventative barrier for some groups across the state. So, to overcome these barriers to collaboration, agencies and organisations need to begin to take active steps to support the fire aspirations of traditional owners. Maintaining intercultural collaborations can present many obstacles and there's need for guidance on how best to work together. And I want to talk about a few examples of that today. So here's a really good resource that has only come out, I guess, in the last 6 months. And it's work that was done by the Natural Hazards Research Centre in a project titled Cultural Land Management Research and Governance in Southeast Australia. And it produced a guide with principles and protocols for people who are engaging with traditional owner groups around cultural land management and research. So it's relevant to government organisations, non-government organisations, and research institutes, and it outlines these principles. Now, what it does is it provides practical advice and guidance on steps people can take to start to develop positive and genuine partnerships. For example, under Principle 1, self-determination to practice culture on country, you have a set of sub-principles. Then you have some example processes, and you have an example protocol as well. So what it does, for the novices in the room, it does actually step out on some genuine things we can do, some practical things that we can do to make sure that collaboration effort has the best chances of success, but is also one that is built on genuine and respectful relationships, respecting Indigenous people's rights and culture. So I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that's been happening in the Port Phillip region, and that's pretty much why I'm here today. Craig invited me here to talk about some of the cool things we're doing to support cultural fire from an interagency collaboration point of view. And I think this is a good case study that potentially other organisations could take in their respective regions. So we've developed this thing, this group called the Cultural Fire Support Network. And what it does is it brings together all these agencies here. So it brings together 2 DECA districts, 3 CFA districts, 4 Parks Victoria districts, 4 individual water corporations, 5 Fire Rescue Victoria districts, and 31 local government areas to talk about the challenges that agencies are having in terms of breaking down their internal barriers to better support cultural fire, and particularly focusing on cultural fire. And it has some particular aims, and it's designed to support the implementation of the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy at a regional level, and is designed to make sure that land managers and partner agencies are collaborating together to adopt standard approaches across land tenure to start to break down some of those siloed barriers that we have and provide a network and platform to share contacts and resources across the agencies included. So why a network? Well, as you can see here, there's lots of players in the game, and everyone has their own area of responsibility and legislation that they adhere to. So by bringing everybody together to simply talk and see what we can do better allows us to start to break down some of those individual siloed barriers and actually start to get people to think about working in a more holistic sense, very much similar to what I've been speaking about for the first part of this presentation around holistic land management. So the journey so far is we've had some on-country conversations and spoken with some traditional owners as well, but in particular we've discussed some really boring topics. We've discussed insurance, funding and equipment, and we've had agencies share some of the lessons learned that they've had in their journeys to support traditional owners and cultural fire. What are the benefits? You're probably not going to be able to see this slide. It doesn't merely look as good on the big screen as it does on the small screen. But we've seen multiple benefits. Agencies are starting to break down barriers. Organisations are at different stages, and by talking about issues and challenges, we actually all start to provide a blueprint for organisations as well. It allows for lots of efficiencies, but each agency is its own organisation, and that can be a true barrier in terms of hindering the full potential of the network. Organisations are at different stages and have different relationships as well, which means that not all organisations have an appetite to be involved truly. And sometimes it's hard to lead to action. There's a balance between informing and making change in a space where we don't lead, we merely support. And it's hard to get consensus when you get all those organisations together into the room. But despite that, we're going to continue to do what we do in the hopes that we'll start to break down some more of those barriers. And there's conversations around how we start to reform to make sure that we are delivering place-based action. And I guess simply what you can do, in this last slide is to talk about, to educate oneself on cultural fire, and you're all here today, so you've all ticked the first box off. To start applying the principles and protocols, to talk about cultural fire management as a tool for land management more widely, and to support aspirations and If you're in your own organisation, start to have the conversations with the people that make decisions to get the money out the door and the support, and to provide places to practice culture. That's the concluding remarks, and I don't think we're doing questions, so that's it. Ahead of time.
Massive thanks to our forum sponsors: City of Yarra, DNA Training, Arbor Green, Merry Creek Management Committee, Ecological Consultants Association Victoria, Stantec Australia, Global Green Environmental, NRM Jobs, and Nature Links. Arbor promotes the study and practice of ecological restoration and fosters and encourages effective management of Australia's natural areas by qualified people based on sound ecological principles. Join us to help promote good work practices, to strengthen our industry and network with like-minded people. Thanks for visiting Regen TV. Call by again soon for more restoration content you can trust.